So the CANDU reactor is different from a pressurized water reactor or boiling water reactor. And as I think you've mentioned in previous podcasts, it's a technology that doesn't require a large, heavy forging, a large pressure vessel. And so you've effectively got a large, the equivalent of a tin can, we call it the calandria vessel, on its side. And then within that, you've got an array of fuel channels. And those fuel channels are primarily made of a zircaloy pressure tube and stainless steel end fittings on the ends. And those are components that effectively form the pressure boundary, and each one is like its own little pressure vessel. They contain the fuel bundles, and the heavy water flows over them, the primary heat transport, the primary coolant, and it's taking the heat away that's generated in the nuclear reaction.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Tim Freeman. I had the pleasure of meeting Tim when he dropped off a CANDU fuel bundle at my house, but also when touring Sheridan Park 3, not 4, I believe, which is this bustling center in Mississauga where the old reactor division of AECL was. Now it's Atkins Realis campus, I guess. Tim, I actually don't know your formal title, and I don't know too much about your background other than that you've been very involved in the refurbishment in Embalse, Argentina. I've been, I really enjoyed our interactions. Obviously, getting the fuel bundle was a bit of a highlight for a nerd like me, and we've made some exercise videos using the fuel bundle. It's fully, fueled with, I think, lead because it's about 60 pounds. But yeah, I've got lots of interest in talking to you about. I'm fresh back from the Canadian Nuclear Association conference, lots of reflections and observations there, and interested in exploring more about the Canadian nuclear industry and understanding it in its sort of full perspective in terms of what are all the things that we do as a result of having CANDU essentially. So Tim, I'll give you 60 seconds to briefly introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and then I'm sure more of you will emerge as we continue this interview.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure, and I really respect the work that you're doing. I think it's extremely valuable to the industry. My title is Vice President and General Manager of Field Services, CANDU Field Services and Manufacturing. And with that, I have oversight for our Field Services branch, which performs maintenance and inspection services around the world at all the CANDU sites. And prior to that, I was the project director for the efforts by our organization as OEM supporting the Embalse refurbishment in Argentina, which went through a life extension. It's a CANDU 6 station, and it was successfully completed at the end of 2018, starting up just in the early days of 2019, 5 years ago. So with that, I'm fairly closely connected with the Argentine CANDU and CANDU friendly industry, which is great and emerging. And I've worked on refurbishment projects both for Bruce Power and for Darlington as well. So yeah, I bring some experience. I did get hired into this business in 2007 after 10 years of machine design to do the ACR 1000 as part of the what was the old Canadum supporting AECL in their bid for the ACR 1000 for Darlington site. So I have some experience from those days, 2007 through 2009 or so, setting up what was going to be hopefully a new build at the Darlington B side. So some experience from those days as well.
So you've also kind of shared some little vignettes of, I think, being in China at a major manufacturing facility. Maybe we'll get into that, maybe we won't, but I do want to say a little bit Canada focused. And some of the reflections I've had coming out of CNA, and having interviewed Dwayne Bratt and continuing to talk to him. For those of you who haven't listened, the politics of Canadian nuclear revival. That's an episode you should probably watch as a prerequisite to this episode. It gives you a great kind of grounding in the history of the Canadian nuclear industry in that Darlington 2009 bid, et cetera. But, Canada stands out in the West right now because we are capable. We're finishing nuclear mega projects ahead of schedule, on budget. That's kind of unheard of with, forget even just nuclear mega projects in general. We've got two large hydro dams that are sort of, I think, still under construction. Site C, Muskrat Falls, double over budget, way behind schedule. Airports, bridges, everything seems hard to build in the West. There's something very special about our nuclear sector, and it's part of what gives us such exceptional social license right now. If we were coming off of huge cost blowout and talking about building new nuclear at Bruce, or the SMRs at Darlington, we might be getting more public acceptance because people are no longer obsessing over three-eyed fish and The Simpsons, but we'd be hurting in that regard. And reading Dwayne Bratt's book with the exciting title of "The Politics of CANDU Export," it really brought to the forefront the reasons why we have this outstanding, again, for the West, vibrant nuclear sector. And in terms of me theorizing and trying to synthesize a grand narrative without commenting too long in this podcast, there's this what I see as a kind of unbroken chain coming right from the wartime investments at Chalk River, the development and scaling up of the technologies that become the CANDU reactor, sort of saturating the market with this ultra quick, 20 reactors commissioned in 22 years in Ontario, saturating a bit of the market and really requiring exports to stay tooled up, to keep the sector vibrant, to keep attracting the talent. And we were dependent on exports. We're competing with large states and massive multinational corporations like GE, Westinghouse, et cetera. And so, those we got those exports right up until Kinshan and China, wrapping up around the year 2000. And then there was a little bit of a desert, but then the refurbs started kicking in. I think Point Lepreau was the first one. And so the refurbs have sustained us, and we find ourselves here as a thriving industry amongst a pretty barren landscape of, huge cost overruns and delays with nuclear projects in the US and in Europe, which I think in the US's case have really led to a lack of confidence and utilities, despite all of the Inflation Reduction Act incentives and despite the emerging need for massive amounts of baseload to power things like gigawatt scale server farms, utilities being really, scared of having another Vogel on their hands. So with all of that in mind, and again, understanding the importance of exports in the past and probably into the future, because we're a small country, it's potentially easy to saturate our own nuclear demand as we did in the 1970s to 90s. The importance of those exports and international work on refurbs really kind of stands out to me. So I'm going to stop my long monologue, but that was one of my big reflections from, again, doing more research, talking to Dwayne Bratt, reading his books, and being at CNA. So again, excited to talk to you about one factor of those exports, and I guess we'll sort of do a case study maybe of Argentina, since that seems where your expertise is not confined to, but where you have a lot of expertise. So I don't know. Let's lay the groundwork and talk a little bit about the Argentinian experience in terms of the
Yeah,
extraordinary
sure.
situation of a
Can
small
I just
country
jump?
exporting. Yeah, please.
Can I just jump in on one comment you made about the last new CANDUs being built in Xinshan, which is technically true for the last new ones that were started, but there was Cernavoda 2 in Romania, which was completed in 2007, which is within the last 20 years, right? So there is a slight correction, and there's a bit of mythology around the idea that we have not had major export of CANDU reactors, therefore no major export of mega projects have occurred. And yet the major refurbishments that happened in Wolsong 1 in South Korea and Argentina, and now in contract and about to happen in Romania, um, and we do also expect further in South Korea and China, also represent significant mega projects that keep the supply chain active and alive, right? So there's a clear continuity if you look at the production of reactor components between components that were built for reactors that came online in the early 2000s, blending into the late 2000s, and then with various refurb projects that have gone all the way through. So it may be true in large rotating equipment, pumps, et cetera, where there is a gap in the production chain, but many of those pieces are fairly universal for all types of different plants, not nuclear specific. So I think it's important to recognize that the refurbishment projects have been able to keep the supply chain healthy all the way through.
I got to say that was something a little bit puzzling about the CNA conference. This is industry association that represents an industry which is kind of, for all intents and purposes, maybe until GE Hitachi really gets going and building their SMRs, for all intents and purposes, is a CANDU industry. We won the Pickering refurbishment. That's, I don't know, the numbers being guessed at, but maybe $17 billion project. seems like worthy of some attention, celebration, events, kind of exploring the implications on the supply chain. We have the Chernivada new builds and the $3 billion from the Export Development Bank in Canada, bringing tons of business to the supply chain. Um, we have Chernivada refurbishments. Again, more industry, more work for the supply chain, and yet you wouldn't know we're a CANDU industry because there wasn't a single event on the main stage. There was an event that Atkins Realis put on in the basement during a refreshment break with no announcement made on stage that it was happening. I missed it, even though I knew about it. To me, that's astounding, and we exist in this situation of where everyone's encouraged to be tech agnostic, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, given again that for all intents and purposes we are still 95% a can-do industry. I don't, it's kind of political to say that, so I'm not asking you to comment, but just a reflection. If you want to comment on it, feel free. Otherwise, feel free to dive into giving us the backgrounder on Argentina.
Yeah, so obviously we need to acknowledge my bias. Obviously, working for Atkins Realis. However, it's fair to say that it's unlikely a CANDU reactor would be built in France. It's never happened before, and I don't know that it's been considered, or in the United States, for example. Right. So when reactors are built around the world in countries that don't have their own domestic technology, export financing, sovereign guarantees come from the parent country, right, for the national home. So I mean, I'll just leave it there. It's interesting to look at what's happening on Ontario now, and it's not dissimilar to what happened during the original bid for Darlington B several years ago. But obviously, biases aside. So let I mean let let's talk about Argentina because it's quite an interesting place. Romania, Argentina, both countries that we consider CANDU and CANDU friendly. Both countries produce heavy water. They are very capable. They have uh, an immensely valuable group of technical expertise, and their universities are producing engineers that are not only nuclear savvy but also being trained on the CANDU technology. In Argentina, they currently have what they call the national project, which is a natural uranium CANDU style reactor, and they are expecting it to be potentially the next reactor that they would build. They're still in discussion about a potential Hualong 1, but at this point, they very much have an interest in maintaining the heavy water and, in particular, natural uranium situation that they currently have expertise and a supply chain that's very healthy in supporting. So they have had plans over the many years to expand their fleet. They've always talked about, going back to the 70s, I think, about having at least 6 reactors domestically. They do have 2 reactors at the Atucha site, which are of an early Siemens design that was not fully supported by the OEM at the time, and they had to finish Atucha 2 on their own with their own know-how and development, and they're immensely proud of that accomplishment. They are actually coming up on a refurbishment for Atucha 1, the original reactor. But the Embalse reactor is the one that obviously we're most interested in, being in the province of Cordoba. And Embalse means reservoir, and it's on a reservoir with an old hydroelectric generation project, which is relatively small in nature. And it's an important piece of technology for them because it supports a good chunk of the grid for what is the second biggest city, Cordoba, in Argentina. Um, I spent 2 years living there for 2017, 2018, and I worked with such a wide array of amazing, talented people, some of whom we have continued to do active work with. Obviously, on many large refurbishment projects, you end up with large groups of people who are temporary labor, trades, engineers, etc. Technical expertise is gained over a 5-year project. And some of those experts, there's no room for them in the long-term operation of the plant because, if you apply the rough metric of saying there's, 1 person per megawatt for the operations team of a nuclear power plant, and it being a single unit station, they already had, for the most part, their complement of staff. And so there remained a handful of individuals who were now CANDU retube experts, and we've actually hired some of them to be our CANDU Argentina representatives supporting that plant and the ongoing needs. And we're in discussions with the various agencies. The equivalent of their national lab is CANEA. They maintain the heavy water plant. They operate the heavy water plant in the south, and they also are doing various SMR, isotope, and other production activities. I had the great honor of being down there for a conference in December of last year, and in that conference, they effectively had the conference labeled, and it's their equivalent of CNA. They had the conference labeled as the Heavy Water and CANDU Conference, right? That was their
Wow.
special focus for last year. Because domestically, they do have a need to restart the heavy water plant and have that heavy water available for their ongoing makeup water for the 3 heavy water reactors, pressurized heavy water reactors that they operate. So I think in a lot of ways, it's a great honor to be considered as a link to the Argentine nuclear industry, as it's a CANDU friendly and a decent CANDU supply chain. They do fuel there with support from Canadian uh, CANDU organization companies. So the refurbishment project was largely performed in Argentina by local labor with support from Canadian technical experts, such as myself and many from our organization, as well as from pretty much all the major players in the CANDU community. And I think there's a model that can work for continuing that effort in future refurbishments. We'll see some of that in Qinshan in China as it sets up for a few refurbishments in the future, and in the Wolsong site in South Korea as it sets up for refurbishment of a few reactors. We also look to the potential for Gentilly 2 to seek the potential to restart that unit, which would be wonderful, right? I think we're seeing a sea change across the whole world, and we've talked before about how this is very different conversation than any of us would have been having a year ago, or certainly 2 years ago. It's been such a rapid change around the industry. With Fukushima in 2011, the prospects of new builds and even refurbishments, to be honest, in some cases, felt like they were flat or gone forever, and that's really changed, and it's encouraging to see.
So, some listeners of this podcast will be familiar with what refurbishment is. I've heard a couple analogies. One is, it's like swapping out the engine in a car. I think there's all kinds of categories. There's no perfect allegory. Dwayne Bratt, I thought, had an even better analogy where he said, "Listen, it's like having a structurally sound, beautiful home that can last hundreds of years, but you got to replace, the furnace, the electric, and the plumbing. I don't know if you're gutting the entire house, but you're, replacing some major systems." And that I thought was a better analogy. Still, it's an analogy. It's imperfect. How do you, to my audience that doesn't know what refurbishment is, explain it? And I mean, what you've touched on how important it is, but I mean, how many reactors around the world, CANDU reactors, have undergone refurbishment? How many do you think will? And what the hell is a 3 tube?
Sure. Um, so the CANDU reactor is different from a pressurized water reactor or boiling water reactor, and as I think you've mentioned in previous podcasts, it's a technology that doesn't require a large, heavy forging, a large pressure vessel, and so you've effectively got a large, the equivalent of a tin can. We call it the calandria vessel on its side, and then within that you've got an array of fuel channels, and those fuel channels are primarily made of a zircaloy pressure tube and stainless steel end fittings on the ends. And those are components that effectively form the pressure boundary, and each one is like its own little pressure vessel. They contain the fuel bundles, and the heavy water flows over them, the primary heat transport, the primary coolant, and it's taking the heat away that's generated in the nuclear reaction. That heat is then passed over to a heat exchanger, which is in the steam generator, and then that steam generator converts that heat into steam on the secondary side, which then drives a steam turbine to make electricity. So when you perform a refurbishment of a CANDU reactor, after nominally a 30-year life, you are primarily replacing the pressure tubes, the calandria tubes that sit outside of those and are thin walled, and the stainless steel end fittings. Those are the main components that get replaced in a refurbishment. And because in a nuclear reactor, all of these metal components are highly irradiated, the removal phase, it breaks down into three primary phases. It's removal, inspection, and then installation. The removal phase is performed with remotely operated robotic tooling. And when we say tools, we colloquially say tools, and people might think of a toolbox in their garage, but these are multi-million dollar massive machines that are fully robotic and remotely operated from a control room, more like a mission control for NASA. And we are setting up on a special work platform that's set up at the reactor face that uh, yeah, has automation to adjust to the specific row and column to be able to line the tool up with a specific channel. And then sequentially by series, we will, you know, cut the pressure tube, remove the end fittings, and then eventually work to finally remove the calandria tube until we've got now an empty vessel, which is the calandria vessel, where we go into the second phase, which is inspection. We go in with special rad tolerant cameras, inspect the vessel for cleanliness, remove any debris, anything that we might find in the bottom, and we prepare all of the components for the reinstallation phase. Now, reinstallation is actually very similar to the same tools that we use in a new build, in new construction. So effectively, we're putting in reverse order now back all the assemblies that form the engine, if you will, and set the reactor up for another 30 years of life. While all that work is happening, and almost always, we call that the retube portion of the refurbishment project. Usually, the retube portion is the critical path, which basically will drive the schedule for a refurbishment outage. And a good rule of thumb is a refurbishment outage is usually around 3 years. Okay, and so the retube portion, once you've completed defueling and dewatering of the reactor, and then your removal, your inspection, and your installation, and then commissioning and startup, that forms the full tail. That's your 3 year cycle. That installation phase is a lot of still somewhat manually operated because humans get up on the platform and are able to. The fields are much lower by the time the irradiated metal components have been removed, and the reactors had a few years by that point to cool off. Humans can get up there and carefully reassemble, just like original construction, the reactor by putting that full array of fuel channels back in. The last piece of all that is the feeders, which are special carbon steel piping that takes the water, both delivers and takes away the water from each fuel channel and collects it up above at a header. And those headers then collect the water and both feed to and return from the steam generators. So it's the feeders and fuel channels that form the retube portion of the work, and it drives the schedule in refurbishment. But often, what will happen along with the retube portion is major other scopes. So, uh, steam generator replacement has been performed at several of the sites. It was not required for Darlington, it was required for Bruce Power, and only in Argentina for the entire CANDU 6 world was steam generator replacement required. So those represent kind of the major components. When you're doing all that work, you can do also balance of plant work. For example, you can do retubing of the condenser, but a condenser is on what we call the rusty side. It's on the conventional side, which is typical of any coal-fired station or any other type of thermal generation. And condenser retubing is a significant challenging job in its own right, but is much more conventional than the specific rad work that we have to do, the radiation work that we have to do for retubing.
Right, right. So, when I was at Sheridan Park, there's this 3D mock-up. I think it's of an ACR, and the core is exposed, and you can see the little fuel bundles. It's truly a exquisite little backgrounder in terms of understanding the CANDU system. I look at it; it looks like a Harley or something. Like and there's so much plumbing and there's so many tubes, compared to, what seems like a simpler system, like a, big pressure vessel, boiling water, pressurized water reactor. Like, it is a bit stupefying looking at it. I've seen some data looking at the Chinese experience, and the median build time and some of the outliers. Um, and it is pretty fascinating. Given the kind of complexity that the CANDU looks like, I believe it was, one of, if not the shortest build time in China. And the Chinese do nuclear well. I think their average median build time, I should say, is around like 5.5 years. The unfortunately the AP1000 and EPRs, I think the design was just incomplete, and they're way out several standard deviations at 9.5 years. And there's the cluster of, I think, the Hualong one typically, or a cap that 1000 takes about 5.5 years. So yeah, given the like complexity, and I guess I'm trying to like steelman other arguments against the CANDU system. Like it looks like a complicated reactor. Um, how was it built on time and on budget? Over and over again overseas, given that complexity. What's your kind of response to that as a criticism of the technology?
Yeah, so if you stand inside the reactor building for a CANDU station, it often looks far more congested than if you are inside a PWR, for example, which has a large pressure vessel in the middle, but is otherwise fairly open, right? The CANDU technology has features and benefits that other reactor types do not have, and obviously co-production of isotopes and on-power refueling. These are all features eh, that are substantial, and also the lack of having to produce that heavy wall forging for the reactor pressure vessel, you know or other components. Um, Now, you asked about specifically the Qinshan original construction. I wasn't on that project, but I worked, starting in 2007, which was, I guess, 5 years after that had started up, with many of the folks that were on that. And as we were starting out with what was the plan for ACR 1000 and the new development of reactors, we spent a lot of time reviewing the OPEX, the lessons learned, what went well, what could have been improved upon from the Qinshan build. And there was a high degree of modularization that was already being put in place for the Qinshan build. And that's significantly different from the stick builds that happened before. In fact, there's always small evolutions through this, and one could argue that the Qinshan build was, the evolution of the Candu 6, that then included features and benefits which may qualify, depending on when you count it, as a Gen 3 reactor, right? So I think a lot of what we're talking about for the new Monarch would take benefit from the latest construction methodologies, the latest uh, ability to integrate a 3D model which has a lot of tight interfaces and parametric control to be able to spit out bills of material and all of your piping modules. You were able to do in the late 90s, early 2000s. You were already able to do piping spools in a very automated way that was not really possible when, for example, Point Lepreau was built or Embalse was built. Even though Qinshan and Embalse notably would call themselves sister plants or of a similar design, because of it being decades later, it significantly was different in terms of construction methodology. So for the most part, you found that the Qinshan design effort that led to the field construction work was driven by a lot of automation and a lot of electronic control of data that led to outputs that were far more field friendly and more suitable for modularization. In general, modularization is just the idea of building in a shop, in a controlled environment, spools that get assembled into a module and then can get dropped into place. And that's not unknown in lots of industries, oil and gas, various other industries, to our organization and many others, and is being credited in a big way with a lot of the time savings that you see, especially in China and other new reactors that have come online since.
Right, right. And I think the kind of world record for construction speed was an ABWR in Japan in 36 months, grid connected in 40 months. Um, you have modular construction with the AP1000 experience, and I think that's a great reactor, but the design was incomplete, the supply chain was cool, and there's a vulnerability to modules if they're not showing up on time or need to be redone because they're not quite the right fit, et cetera. And that can plague any industry or any design, I guess. So it's interesting. Like, modular is such a buzzword now. I mean, the branding with small modular reactors, it creates a lot of confusion because a lot of people are not understanding there's a micro reactor and a grid scale SMR where there's still a lot of stick build, and it's not just all built in a factory and effortlessly plugged into site like a Lego. But yeah, that modularity sounds like that started to be increasingly part of the builds. One talking point that I've heard is the last 7 C6s were built on time. What is that time? And that would suggest that it's not just in the Chinese experience, but in these other countries. Is I'm trying to fact check that statement, but what's been the experience?
Yeah, I don't at hand have the construction duration for the Qinshan units, which would have been the last one that you could credibly say started and finished in a cycle, because obviously Chernobyl 2, which was completed in 2007, was started significantly earlier and paused for a long time. So um, sorry, I don't have that information, but I do know that for the most part, when we talk about the last 7 C6s, you'd be talking about obviously Chernobyl. Chernobyl 2. You'd be talking about the two units in China, and you'd probably be talking about three of the four at Wolsong, because 2, 3, and 4 were built as a triple, much after Wolsong 1, which predated. Um, and so I'm not sure what the seventh would be in that equation. But notably, as we go through that list, those are all foreign builds, right?
So, Tim, another kind of reflection from CNA was that in previous years there wasn't much going on. There weren't really a lot of planned projects. I guess there was the competition at the Darlington site between Terrestrial Energy, X Energy, and GE Hitachi, and so that, I guess, kind of predated me to some degree in terms of my involvement in this. So maybe the knives were sort of out, maybe they were still in their sheaths, but this was a different CNA from the perspective of we have a new build, we have an RFI at Bruce, there's tech selection, there's not a sort of shoe-in candidate, there's competition. And so, it seems like there's been sort of an unwritten rule of the nuclear industry, which is like, thou shalt not talk smack about anybody else. And it just felt like that veneer was starting to wear off. Again, thinking back to Dwayne Bratt's book about the politics of exports, in the export market, that's a crazy world. The knives are out there, I would say, metaphorically. Canada was a very small nation. Again, I've sort of went through that in terms of, at that time it was a crown corporation up against big multinational established OEMs, and a small country with a smaller ability to finance. In the 90s, there were sort of a flurry of CANDU builds in Korea and China. I mean, it might have preceded your time, but I'm just trying to get a sense of that export world, and kind of what that's like for a small country to be competing against much larger players. And it's to me, it stands out, or it is outstanding, that such a small nation exported so many reactors overseas, in competition with stronger countries and industries.
Yeah, I think credit needs to go to strong federal government support to get these reactors built around the world. And that continues, it was true then, and it continues to be true today. So if there is not a sovereign guarantee coming from the government of Canada, it will be very difficult to build any new CANDU reactor internationally. So we see it even in large refurbishment projects, but uh, most most pointedly, with the capital investment required, the export financing promised by the Canadian government to support the Chernobyl 3 and 4 completion, which is kind of a half project because they're started already, um, is critically important to the success of that job. And that will be true in a future CANDU in Argentina, a future CANDU in any other country around the world. We see the whole world is interested in CANDU and its features and benefits, the co-production of isotopes and the natural uranium that leads to energy security, the on-power refueling, and the potential for a 90-year life with a three tube, as we touched on but didn't quite get into. All of those are tremendous advantages, and a lot of countries are quite interested in what the CANDU technology, either in a you know 750 megawatt or 1,000 megawatt, can offer to their grids. And yet the politics tie very closely to support from the federal government. And I think that's why the recent announcement of the support of AECL and the federal government for that you would have seen at CNA last week is critically important to the potential to continue the legacy of building new CANDUs internationally.
Like, what's the value of building internationally? I mean, these are potentially high risk projects. It sounds like the most recent builds in Walsong in China, had a net benefit, but it's a risk, and I understand again from Dwayne's book. You have Export Development Canada, and there's actually even the Canada Fund for potentially risky large investments overseas. What's the benefit that accrues to Canada from exports of our CANDU technology?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, Canadian companies, Canadian nuclear energy workers like myself, and there's 80,000 of us, I think, approximately, that depend on good, high-paying jobs for being in the industry, and that will only grow if we continue to export internationally. So, what we see as a benefit is ongoing services and support work. So there are engineering services provided by our company and others to all of the CANDU countries and the utilities that operate CANDU reactors. There are field services opportunities for inspection and maintenance activities, and there's supply of equipment and fuel and all kinds of other components which will go on for as many years as those reactors continue to operate. So it builds a robust supply chain and good high paying jobs for Canadians when CANDU reactors are selected for building in other countries.
Do you have a sense of kind of the dollars and cents of that from a specific project? I know with the Chernivada new builds, Export Development Canada made a $3 billion sovereign-backed loan to Romania. I understand that that money has to all be spent in Canada. It sounds like a typical sort of foreign aid package where it's like, here's some aid, but you got to spend it all here. In this case, I guess it's not aid; it's a loan. But
It's a loan.
yeah, just in terms of the
And
dollar
almost
and cents
always
of
it's a
that
loan,
value
right?
of,
In
of
in almost all
exports.
cases. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if I cut you off there. In almost all cases, it's a loan, and those loans do need to be paid back. But it's all about the capital investment that's required to get major refurbishment and new build projects going. And it's very different from somebody that can be, a merchant plant that is standing up, a gas or cogen plant somewhere can be done in a fraction of the time and a fraction of the cost, and they don't need to lean on the federal government for support for a job like that. But obviously, it doesn't have the climate benefits that nuclear does. Right? It's not green power. So, in order to push towards decarbonizing this country, and obviously other countries have similar goals, you need significant capital investment, and it's about backstopping those mega projects. And this is where sovereign guarantees from the Canadian government are critically important.
In terms of the most recent builds in Xinjiang, what was striking was these trade missions. I guess Canada sort of struggled with its policies towards free trade. A recently deceased former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney famously negotiated NAFTA. For better or worse, I think you'll find different opinions across society, particularly with that having been ripped up recently unilaterally by Trump and renegotiated. But one part of that legacy was these big trade missions where the prime minister, cabinet ministers, a bunch of business representatives would fly around the world and ink business deals. I believe that was, a part of. I'm not sure if it was the Wall Song, if that was before Chrétien or the certainly the Chin builds. I don't know if you have any kind of reflections on that or further insights.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Although the world appears to be changing reasonably quickly, and it's anyone's guess where we're going to be in a year or two. And unfortunately, the long cycle of the development of a nuclear power plant requires a long-term commitment, and so we need to have stability. And often through these trade agreements, you get the stability, but required to be able to make long-term commitments to get a new reactor built.
Let's talk a little bit just briefly about this three tube concept. I guess no plant has been three tubed yet. What's the sort of technical discussions around this? You're obviously an expert in this area, I hear 90 years. I mean, Pickering B. There's some reactors that are close to 40 years of operation. Does that mean 120 years potentially? It's just interesting. We're starting to see that with PWR fleet as well. Life extensions, license extensions going up to 80 years. And I've really started to think about nuclear more broadly as very similar to hydroelectric infrastructure, where huge upfront capital costs, amazing long-term value propositions, doesn't work terribly well for people with return on investment outlooks of 5 years, but sort of nation building infrastructure that's durable. So yeah, I don't know if riff off the sort of similarities of hydro and nuclear, or and just the sense of the possibility of three tubes or three
Yeah,
tubing.
I'll just briefly touch on the concept of three tube. It's the third life cycle, and so when you build a nuclear power plant, and in particular a CANDU station, there's a tremendous amount of concrete that goes into it, and for the most part, with the proper protection, that concrete can last a very long time. It's usually very high quality concrete in all the existing stations today, and it's carefully monitored and protected. And once you've got that infrastructure in place, and we've evaluated and see no fundamental barriers to the Calandria vessel being suitable for a third cycle, then you're back into the same retube concept where you're replacing the feeders, you're replacing the potentially steam generators, and often steam generator replacement is certainly going to be required before a full 90 year, even if you could justify a 60 year. And fuel channels and feeders can easily be done. It's been proven. It's now a very efficient and reliable process that can be trusted to be on time and on budget. And that's the enabler, obviously, to continuing with the Pickering work. So then the last piece of the puzzle is you look back at what was the original design for the reactor, what technology existed at the time in terms of safety, what will the regulator accept as the safety case. And for the most part, I would say all or nearly all of the operating reactors today have a credible case to be continued to operate for the third cycle between 60 and 90 years with a second retube. So we won't see it until one of the retubed reactors approaches now its end of second cycle. I know there was a report came out of Point Lepreau where they mentioned that that was a possibility. Um, Obviously, some of the other sites would include, Bruce 1 and 2, which completed about 12 or so years ago. And then Embalse is 5 years in, so in approximately 25 years, you'd be up for the potential for a third cycle through a retube. So, I mean, it's great. And there are some licensing differences. You mentioned the PWRs. There are some licensing differences typically between how the CANDU reactors are licensed in almost all jurisdictions, but not all, where typically we get licensed to operate CANDU reactor for a number of effective full power hours, which translates into that 30 years. And it's about how your capacity factor is, what your uptime versus downtime. And it's different from a lot of the PWRs. As I understand, the PWRs often get licensed on an interval basis, whether it's 10 years or potentially 20 years. It's more a direct interval decade based process. And so, therefore, how we monitor the effectiveness and safety of the CANDU reactors is somewhat and slightly different from how the PWRs are measured. And that does have a bearing in the long-term operations and how the different reactors are extended and licensed.
Let's talk a little bit about the ways that the refurbs have gone. I think the first candidate to be refurbed was LaPro. That's probably challenging in terms of it being a smaller province, a bit further from the nuclear expertise in the kind of heartland of Ontario. There was definite struggles with refurbishment early on. I think the Pickering A units also kind of went significantly over budget. But now we're at a place where the Darlington refurbs are coming in 6 months ahead of schedule. So walk me through kind of how that's occurred. I guess sometimes you hear about a negative learning phenomenon with nuclear new construction. Hopefully, you don't have that. This is certainly a positive learning story. And in addition to that, and I should probably just ask this a second question later, but I'm just curious as well about going forward with new designs of CANDU's, lessons learned. Like, there's this concept of sort of what I'll call sort of blue sky innovation, which is like, let's try something completely novel, or, in the case of advanced nuclear, it's often stuff that's not novel but was tried in the 50s and 60s. But let's go with a new moderator, new coolant, that kind of thing. I'll call that sort of blue sky innovation. And there's innovation which is from mature technologies with proven track records, that you kind of gain insights from operation and then are going to make changes based upon that. So let's talk about refurbs, what's been learned, why they're getting better, and with a view towards future CANDU designs, and how to sort of minimize that refurbishment window. Because I think in terms of the lifetime capacity factors, being offline for 2 to 3, well, let's say it, 3 years, certainly changes the economics of the reactor.
Right. So, in refurbishment space for CANDU reactors, there were a variety of early attempts at refurbishment that were done, Pickering A and all before my time, and I don't want to comment too much on that because I'm not super aware. You mentioned LaPro. LaPro and Wolsong were largely done together. Wolsong was in the end, schedule wise, definitely far more successful than Point LaPro. And then Bruce 1 and 2 through the same period, completed in, I believe, 2011. And that then led into Embalse refurbishment. And Embalse was very successful with the highest scope of a CANDU 6 station for refurbishment. And then the Darlington 1, 2, 3, 4 refurbishment, which is nearing completion and has been very successful. And then the Bruce MCR project, which is in flight right now and also on track, very successful as well. So I think what we see is a pattern where lessons have been learned along the way around the design of the specialized tooling and improvements of those designs to be able to perform better and better as we've progressed, and we've really honed and refined what retube tooling looks like at this point. We got the benefit of what worked and didn't work on previous refurbishments, to a point now where we are seeing cycle times, for the various series that are basically getting better and better, right? And it's a reliable, proven process. We also see a relationship between owner and contractor in the execution of the refurbishments, which has improved dramatically. And there's less conflict and more cooperation. And that's a huge benefit to the overall project, the one team approach that you hear about for the Darlington refurbishment in particular, and also in the Bruce MCR job. So success of recent retubes has been a huge part of why we're even talking about the social license for Pickering refurb and new builds, right? Um, I think there's a whole bunch of uh, specific and detailed lessons that get applied as we set out to do every future job. So, as the setup for the Pickering refurbishment, we're now looking at the fine-tuned refinements that were successful at Darlington and for the Bruce MCR, and we are applying those lessons to the setup for how we engage the trades, how the training's done, how the tools are built, how the tools operate, and we look for innovations. There are a few fascinating and successful innovations where, for example, pressure tube removal and calandria tube removal were two separate series in the past. And for Darlington, we developed an innovation that allowed for the combined removal of pressure tubes and calandria tubes at the same time, thus saving a whole series and about a month of critical path. So it's that type of thing that then we can apply to future refurbs, and drive cost and schedule down further, and make it more competitive and get those reactors back online sooner. So I think we're seeing proven results that now build from a strong team with high quality tools, and a cooperative and collaborative owner overseeing the work.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting analysis in terms of the factors at play. And I think often what gets neglected, certainly, in my perspective of nuclear communications, and some of the ideas that I think have come out of a decade of inactivity, where there's been a large focus on concepts and branding in terms of small modular reactors, and a lot of frankly kind of fantasy thinking because there's just not the seriousness of ongoing projects. Again, with the CANDU refurbishments being the exception. But that human factors element, having a hot supply chain, but even when you say supply chain, you think about factories and tools. You don't think about people. And I don't even know if there's a word to talk about hot people. I mean, that sounds like I'm talking about celebrities, but the human excellence that's there, that's been cultivated and maintained. And that kind of feeds back to my initial sort of commentary about this unbroken chain of activity of the Canadian nuclear sector, which makes Ontario a very attractive place to do new nuclear. And I think is drawing in a lot of interest in this competitive bidding process from outside technologies. I guess I think we're kind of coming into a landing on this topic. I'm quite confident I'll be talking to you in the future some more. Um, yeah, I've been inspired by a quote from Jeremy Whitlock, who's kind of a legend of Canadian nuclear. He has the Canadian Nuclear FAQ website. If you're curious about CANDU technology, it seems like in the international world, people are unfamiliar, and maybe justifiably so because we're again a smaller country with a radically different reactor concept. But I thought that this quote really summed things up quite nicely. It's a little long, but I'm going to read it anyway. Remember that this is a country that in the 1960s bet the farm on a crazy idea that robotic machines could refuel a 300-degree nuclear furnace at 100 atmospheres without spilling a drop of heavy water, and then proceeded to spill it by the barrel at the nuclear power demonstration reactor because that's what water does. They tightened their torques, hired a bunch of crazy out of work engineers from the equally crazy Avro Aero project, built a better fueling machine, and moved on to put the only non-US nuclear reactor on the market. For me, that just nationalism is a dirty word. Maybe economic nationalism is less of a dirty word. Public interest is another one, but it makes me sort of proud when thinking about a nation, which in its history, the only nation in the Americas that, other than I think Belize, that didn't have a war of independence against its colonial masters, was very much kind of kept in line and almost willingly kept itself in line to be a country that just provided, low revenue natural resources to the mother country to be turned into finished products in a kind of mercantilistic relationship. We were famously hewers of wood and haulers of water, as C.D. Howe, the minister of everything during World War II, said, and we really stepped up our game with the war, providing insane amounts of war material to the Allied effort. I'm kind of wrapping up on a bit of a rah notice, but it's a kind of genuine feeling for me. I think there's a pressure right now to be tech agnostic, which I find personally a little unusual. I mean, I've not chosen to have weird slogans like "We can do it" just out of for no reason. So in terms of that pressure on myself, I don't know. It's just like renewables. Like I kind of make my decisions based on a series of goals. So I'm not going to deliver any more of a pep talk here. I've done too much of that. I'm obviously conflicted on this topic. Um, and I'm doing too much personal reflection. So Tim, I'll let you do a little personal reflection to close this off. Any other sort of closing comments that you have? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I'm really proud to be in this industry, and I've got kids, and I think we're doing good work for the sake of the country, for the sake of the planet, and I think it's very important to acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of some tremendous giants in the industry that have given us this gift of a technology and the momentum, and I think it's incredibly important to keep it going, right? I believe that the CANDU technology will exist through three tubes for many years to come. So it is here to stay forever, as far as I'm concerned. And it behooves us to do the best effort to continue to honor the legacy of those that came before us and built the CANDU technology. Because in my career in this industry, I've had the great pleasure of working with many individuals who have been on CANDU builds, new builds in Canada and all around the world, and started their careers in the 1960s. And I think it's important to honor their legacy and all the knowledge transfer that they've given to us, and effectively innovate and continue to deliver to the world what this amazing technology can do.
All right, Tim. It's been a blast. Thanks for stopping by the Decouple studio, well, remotely,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll talk again soon, I'm sure.